Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session about using science fiction to think about our futures. It is my great pleasure to be here for the Dubai Future Forum once again, and to be accompanied by some wonderful writers to discuss science fiction and the science fiction imaginaries. My name is Glyn Morgan. I'm the head of collections and principal curator at the Science Museum in London. I'm also a science fiction scholar and academic, which is how I get my reason for being in such illustrious company. On my left immediately is Samit Basu. He is a novelist, a writer of comics and animations, and a film director from Kolkata, India. To his left is Ramona Emerson, a Diné writer and filmmaker from Tehachapi, New Mexico, in the USA. And on the far side is Sui Davis Okumbogwa, professor of creative writing at the University of Ottawa, Canada, where he currently lives, and he's written many acclaimed works, most recently winning the Ignite Award for his novella, Lost Ark Dreaming. Congratulations on that, by the way. Oh, very nice. And Sui was also one of my co-judges. We were both two of the three judges on this year's Future Stories competition, which stay seated afterwards for the awards ceremony for that. So to get us started about thinking about science fiction and what it can bring to the way that we think about the world, I thought I'd start with Sui and the competition and ask you to reflect on being a judge for the competition and reading the over 200 stories that were submitted to us. And you know, as an educator, as someone that teaches creative writing as well, why do you think it's important for competitions like this to exist and to foster new voices in a science fiction community? Like, why are new voices important?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've found to be interesting about conveying ideas through storytelling is I think storytelling is one of the oldest forms of conveying ideas and transmuting our imaginations and our, in a sense, futures thinking to a larger aspect of the community or to a larger community. And so I think that employing storytelling in that kind of thinking is crucial. Fostering the practice of storytelling itself from as early as possible is also crucial. Part of why I teach creative writing or why I work in that field is because I think honing that practice is useful. And so when you combine that with I guess the tools of thinking about the future, and you implement that in what we understand to be the oldest form of transmuting these ideas, we sort of have a very powerful tool at our disposal of telling stories. So I think a contest like this is basically doing that work. It's basically telling these folks who have written into the competition that they can imagine, and it's sort of putting them in this position to imagine and start practicing those tools of both storytelling and futures thinking at the same time, and to a degree rewarding them for it. So that's why I think it's useful.
Yeah, no, I think that I agree with those reflections as someone else who read all of those stories. And the idea of science fiction or imaginative literature in general as a tool, as a toolkit for thinking about the world differently, I think is where its true value is. It's interesting, in those 200 stories, there was so much variation and so much diversity and breadth of interest and style on show, and they were all anonymized, so we don't know where any of them were from or who wrote them, but you could just see like this range. But there were still very dominant themes that came through. So anxieties and fears of climate change, for obvious reasons, were in quite a lot of the stories. And then there was a spectrum of people who were writing about AI, who were very hopeful and excited about it, and then people who were quite pessimistic and scared. And I think science fiction is a vehicle to explore those complex issues that have a lot of variables and are a really interesting way of kind of engaging with that. Ramona, I want to come to you because I do think it's imaginative literatures as a whole, not just science fiction. So your book, Shutter, and its sequel Exposure, which you were signing earlier on, these are books about a crime scene photographer, and to a certain extent, they're very autobiographical. They're based on your own lived experience. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and then how you used the books to kind of work through or process the cultural difficulties of working in that field as a person, an indigenous person from your part of North America?
Absolutely. I worked as a forensic photographer in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 16 years. And over that time, I was challenged a lot about my work because in Diné culture, death is the biggest taboo. We are not supposed to talk about death. We don't talk about people who have passed on. We are not supposed to mention their names because culturally we believe that if we talk about them and we include death in that conversation, then we never allow that person to pass on to the next world. And so when I decided to write this book, I wanted to really think about how that work implies for other Diné people who work around death. And when I say that, I mean doctors, EMTs, people who work like every day and seeing and living death. And as a forensic photographer, I also saw that. But I wanted to make sure that as the act of talking about it, the act of physically breaking a taboo has forced a lot of my own people, Diné people, to look at our own superstitions surrounding death and how it may be hindering us. It may be allowing people to take advantage of our superstitions and our beliefs in a real way in the real world, in the now. And so by telling this story, I think a lot of Diné people have responded to me that, in a way, kind of telling me, well, thank you for saying out loud what we were all so afraid to say. Because I think we were taught from small children that if we talk about it, we will bring it to us.
Yeah.
We will ask for death.
Yeah.
And the process of talking about it and writing about it has proved to them that it's okay to talk about death. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to be overcome by the loss of somebody that you love. Because when we are children, we are taught we have 4 days to mourn. And after those 4 days, we have to stop. We cannot cry for them. We cannot talk about them. We cannot mention their names. And I think it has caused a huge rift within us that we are not allowed to grieve, and we are not allowed to talk about it and to overcome it. And so by the act of writing this book, I think has made a lot of my own Diné people realize that it's okay to mourn. It's okay to talk about these difficult things because it's part of our life.
Yeah, because in the book, the main character is very explicitly confronted by death, not only in her profession as a forensic photographer, but because she sees ghosts, and those conversations that she has both with the living and the dead allow you to foreground that kind of debate around death and in the culture. As well as other issues like, violence against women is a very strong theme in the books as well, and again, something which is not adequately talked about in a lot of societies. And it provides a platform for that. Did you find that, did you have a moment where you considered writing the book without the ghost stories and making it non-supernatural, or was it always something you thought would help you, enable that dialogue?
I think that when I began to write the book, it was very solidly about my experiences as a forensic photographer. But I could see through the development of the story that it wasn't enough. There was something missing still, and I didn't feel like I was fully expressing my thoughts on it. But in my mind, I thought, what is the most taboo thing that could happen to a Navajo woman as a child? Even what's the most vile thing that Navajos would think could happen to you. And that would be that you would hear the voices of the dead, that you would be able to communicate with people on that side of the veil.
Yeah.
And so when it was like an epiphany, I think one day when I was writing and I realized, oh my goodness, what if Rita could see the people, the victims that she was photographing, and that they were standing right there, able to tell her who murdered them, who hurt them. But then Rita would have to figure out a way to investigate it and take photographs and use the image to prove the case.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't be able
A ghost told me doesn't hold up in a court
right.
of law.
You can't just tell the police, oh, the ghost was standing there and he told me what happened. And so it allowed my protagonist so much more leeway to develop that from childhood all the way into adulthood and learn how to use it and work with it to bring justice to people who otherwise would not have it.
Yeah.
And in so many instances in this book and in Exposure, it's always women. It's always about the violence against women in indigenous countries or indigenous communities is something we're struggling with in America even today. A lot of women go missing and murdered, and they just don't investigate it. And so it allowed me also a platform to push that narrative, and through Rita's gift of seeing ghosts and through Rita's gift of photography, she's able to really bring voice and justice to those things and bring education to people outside of my own community to realize what we need and want to do about finding justice.
And the idea of writing that kind of story is obviously very novel and unprecedented within the Diné community because of those taboos. Samit, in India, there is a much deeper and longer tradition of writing speculative, imaginative stories that blend myth and fantasy and science. What role is science fiction playing in a country or a community like the Indian community, do you think?
Right. With most of the world, I think there's a broader cultural understanding that's evolving now in the algorithm age that, people of this vast geographical region, whether it's India or anywhere else in the world, are not homogenous, which is fairly logical. But and everyone knows this, but there is, the tendency to oversimplify regions like the one we're sitting in now or the one where I'm from. There are so many different kinds of people, and they all have their own scientific traditions, their cultural traditions, their very diverse histories, their conflicts among themselves. So the landscape is constantly shifting, and in a way, the way that the algorithm age where we live now is that there is no one way to see the world. It's all getting fragmented into this vision where we barely know what to believe, what to see, and all of that. And I think, and on top of this, you have these vast forces which are shaping all our lives in the moment. And, I think it's important to remember that while science fiction has always imagined futures, and it's taken on sometimes the job of predicting futures, which is not its job. Its job is, as you said, to kind of articulate and project the anxieties and the hopes and dreams of the time and the place that they're written in and the people who are writing them. So India is always something where every time I'm kind of tasked with the idea of representing it or saying something on behalf, I barely know anything about the country despite having lived in it my whole life, because so many languages, so many ways of being, so many politics, all stuffed together. Each of them has their imagination. Each of them has their relationship with science, culture, art, all of it. And the way that these seeds scatter around the world, and the way that, say, Indian scientific traditions then express themselves in, say, large technology companies in the US, where so many CEOs of the biggest tech companies are of Indian origin, is something where, I think it's sociology's job to capture that more than science fiction's, but its effect on science fiction right now is that more Indian actors are being cast in these roles as the people who are, taking vast and sometimes bad decisions on the behalf of all mankind.
Yeah, and it's good to talk about casting because we're here. You are here in your capacity as writers, and we're here talking or setting up for a short story competition. But science fiction is, of course, a multimedia genre, and it exists in films and video games and everything. But is there something that is particularly special about the written form of science fiction, do you think, in the work that you do? You've written for film, you've written animations, and you've written novels and short stories. What is science fiction working differently in those fields, do you think?
I think there's a big tension between the media in science fiction because it's a medium that it's a genre that lends itself to such vast visions, right? Dubai from zoomed out.
Yeah.
What is this giant city doing? And the danger of the written aspect of science fiction is that because reading is such a private act and because reading kind of happens at the velocity of the reader's brain, the excitement of a vast idea and the time it takes to kind of, because a lot of science fiction will tell you this is a vast idea, however, here's the fine print, here's the catch, here's the cost of this bright idea, but your brain wants to see the huge vision.
Yeah.
But it doesn't want to read the fine print, the terms and conditions of this, which science fiction has warned you about. But then you want to push the big red button anyway because it's big. So where I find it very kind of interesting when it's about text is the additional pressure on every writer in this very attention span deficit, multimedia, oversaturated age. The difficulty of pulling the reader's brain into what you're doing and keeping them there is now a high endurance, high demand sport.
Yep.
When you have technology that can design your galactic thing for you, a copy of a copy of a copy, but still big and still colorful and splashy, then how do you, as a writer, choose your words to keep your reader's brain from wandering and make them read the fine print of some very dangerous ideas?
It's very true, and I think that's a challenge for any long form of art is that engagement and that attention wandering. But I think that for me, the strength of a novel as a form in particular is you have to, an average novel takes, 12 hours of reading for most people, perhaps more, perhaps less. Science fiction novels often very chunky. That's 12 hours of being in brain-to-brain contact with another human, thinking about issues of the future. And it's that empathic connection and character-driven element that I think is what sets science fiction apart from kind of just scenario prototyping and some of the other kinds of ways of thinking about the future, because you are forced to do it through the eyes of a person or people, and that I think adds a lot to it. And so I want to come back to you, Sui, because a lot of your work, draws on African themes and mythologies and whatnot. How important is it for you to express that in your work and show, the phrase Afrofuturism, show that there is a place for people in the future that are not clean-cut American GIs or whatever the stereotype might be, a Heinlein stereotype?
I think we talked about this last year, where one of the sticking points for us was how centered in community most of the stories received were. And I think the same thing repeated itself this year. I think one of the things I always say when I talk about my work is that as much as when we think of science fiction as a larger collective, we often tend to think through the lens of infrastructure, technology, of what I like to think of as stuff that is more built environment, institutional. But I think predominantly, and this sort of ties into the question about what literature does specifically, is that, first of all, the story is a story about people.
Yep.
It starts from the story about people. So science fiction predominantly is good science fiction. The right kind of science fiction is a story about people. It's really about how it's the human condition of a community, of the people in a community, and how they're navigating systems that mostly just happen to have certain infrastructure, certain technological infrastructure as part of that system. And so if I were, as I am writing as, an African person or a person of African descent, I am therefore engaging in that thinking first from the person, and then I am taking that and applying it through infrastructure. And so if I'm being honest about the stories that I'm telling, and I am representing the self in those stories, then therefore it will have that manifestation of my African personhood in its telling, my African way of being, African epistemologies, ways of organizing principles of the African self, etc. All of these things become, I think, the first port of call when you're thinking about that imagination. And then you start to apply the other externalities to it, of which infrastructure will be part of it, technology will be part of it, but I wouldn't start from the externalities, which I think tends to be what I like to think of as the shorthand, sort of the heuristic, the default thing we reach for when we think about science fiction. But I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's first a story about people and sort of everything else that stems from them as opposed to is applied to them from the outside.
Yeah, and I think if we bring it full circle to the impending awards and the competition, I think that is one of the things that I enjoyed most about reading the stories that we read, was seeing all of the writers putting themselves or a version of themselves into their stories, expressing their identities. And it was in a panel earlier on, and I'm really sorry if the person who said this is in the audience, because I didn't write it down, so I cannot remember who exactly to attribute this to, but someone said the phrase about reclaiming the power to imagine our own futures. And for me, that is such a wonderful thing that science fiction can do, and the value of it on a global stage, and a stage like this forum, where Emiratis, people from the Middle East, people from all over the world can imagine futures that are their futures, not the future that is exported to them from another country, whatever country that might be. And in science fiction, there is obviously a cultural lodestone of American work, and before that, European, British, French work. But that is shifting, and it's so exciting to see that coming through, and to see it in the range of stories. And so to plug the stories, the top 10 winners from this year are all available online, and you can and should read them. But that is unfortunately all the time I have to talk to these wonderful people about science fiction. It's been a sprint to get through a wonderful conversation with them. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.